Okay, today we're going to look at something that's really cool called Matter.js. It is a 2D physics engine for the web, as it says here, and I use it in a few of my websites, and you can see that you can do a lot of stuff with it, and it's insanely easy to set up all different sorts of simulations. So yeah, it's just really fun to play with, and we're just going to mess around with a few of the stuff here. So of course, the first thing that we need to do is download it, and you can see when you go to this website, which is brm.io/matter.js. If you go there, you can see that we have all of this stuff, and you can just click the install page, and after you wait for it to load, you can see that here it brings you to the GitHub page, and it has a lot of stuff and documentation and everything else. But first of all, what we want to do is download it. You can see that when you scroll down, it tells you how to install, and you can use npm, but I really don't like using npm, and it's annoying and stuff, so we're just going to download the script here from the releases page, right? So just click on that, and you can see that we have all sorts of releases. We're just going to click on the most recent one and download the zip file, just like that. Now you can just head to wherever folder that is downloaded. For me, it's in the downloads, and after you unzip the file, you should have a folder called Matter.js with 15 items in it. So let's just click open, and you can see that it has tons of scripts. I think you can just ignore all of them. Most of them are like example stuff and demonstrations, but for this, go and click the build folder at the top. So the one called build, and we have matter.js and matter.mint.js. We're just going to choose the mint.js because it's a smaller file. Now what we're going to do is create a folder on your desktop or anywhere you want. I'm just going to title it Matter.js demo, something like that, and I'm just going to move the matter.js folder the matter.js file inside. Great. And now what we can do is just open Sublime Text, open that folder on our desktops. You can see we have this file, but let me just full screen these now. So now we can just create a new file, save it, call it index.html, and make sure you save it in the correct place, which is the folder that we just created. And yeah, we can just enter the starter code by typing HTML and pressing tab. I'm just going to make the title Matter.js, something like that. And now of course we need to include the script file, so we can just do script, type JavaScript, src equals matter.js. And now we have actually just set up everything that we need. So now what we can do is we're basically done with the HTML, so we are going to write our own code and create our own JavaScript file. So let's just create a new file and save it, call it script.js or anything you want, save it right there. And now of course we have to add it to the HTML by doing this. So script.js, and yeah, by the way, I forgot this should be called matter.mint.js because that's the name of the file we had. Another thing that we're gonna do is add defer to our script.js file because we need to wait until the whole HTML file is loaded because we need to get some elements, and this just makes it easier. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is open up our website by going to the matter.js folder, opening it up, and double clicking on the HTML file. And this opens it up, and as you expect, gives you a blank file. I'm just going to split screen these two just so that it makes doing everything a bit easier. So a good thing to do, of course, is always to use the documentation. So here's what you can do, right? You just go to the website, and at the site you can see that it has docs, documentation, demos. We're just going to click documentation, and here you can see that it has a getting started link. So let's just click that, and you can see it shows you this. Of course, what we're going to do is basically almost copy this, but I'll explain a bit more. So the first part, we're just going to create some aliases, as I said, basically like stuff that can help you, like different modules or different functions that I can do, and we're just going to create a bit of like shortcuts to it, right? So var engine equals matter.engine, and everything else you can create another variable, var render, this is for rendering, equals matter.render, var runner equals matter.runner, matter.bodies, like that. And finally, var composite equals matter.composite. Of course, declaring all these variables do nothing for the moment, right? They basically act as shortcuts. And now what we can do is you can see that we have to create an engine and create a render. So we can basically initialize it or instantiate it by doing engine equals engine.create. And so we're creating a new variable called engine that's lowercase. So it's really simple. And now our render equals render.create, same thing. Render.create. And that's it. We just need to get a few options. For example, where to render the element, right? The element in your HTML that we want to render, because we want it to be full screen, we can just do element equals, or element, yeah, the property is document dot body. Just like that. And the engine, we are going to pass it the engine. And that's all there needs to create the render and the engine. And now you can see us creating a bunch of bodies and whatever, but we're just going to skip that part and start running it, right? So render.run, render, like that. And you can see that you have to also create a runner to run the stuff. So render only renders it to the screen and doesn't simulate anything, and runner basically is the engine and the stuff that drives the actual simulation. So we can do var runner equals runner dot create to make a new runner, and runner dot run. And this is a function that has two parameters. You can pass it in the runner and the engine that we created before. So this is all the setup code that we need. And now we can just switch to our website and see what it shows. So let's reload. And you can see that we have this blank canvas. So you can see it's really not that hard. Let me just go over all the code once again to make sure you understand what we did. So basically in the HTML, we just only added a script. So we linked both of our script tags, the library, and our own script. And we left the HTML in the body empty. Now at the top, this is not doing anything at all. We're just declaring shortcuts, so we don't need to type matter dot a lot of times, right? We just need to type engine instead of matter dot engine because objects are referenced. So yeah, all these are just shortcuts, so we don't need to keep typing stuff all the time. And here we created the engine by using engine.create and assigned it to a variable called engine, which is lowercase. And also we created the render, which is also lowercase, using render.create. And we set the element to document.body, so we created it on the body or inside the body, right? And engine, we just pass in the engine. And for the render, all we need to do is call render.run and then pass in the render that we created. And we created a runner called runner.create. So we created a runner, and then we did runner.run, and then we passed it in the runner and the engine. So basically, yeah, we're just getting a blank canvas set up. I don't like how this is not full of the screen, right? It's just a square. So I'm just going to change that now, but you can do it by typing render.canvas.width, and we're just going to set it to the Windows width by typing window.inner width. The window object, of course, is not supplied by window.js. It's standard to all browsers, right? It's one of the APIs for doing all sorts of stuff. So inner width is just a JavaScript thing that you can get the width of the entire window in pixels. And we're going to do the same thing for the height. But this time type window.inner height instead of inner width. Just like that. And now it fills the screen. But you might notice that there's a bit of like an edge around it, and that's because by default HTML adds a 5 pixel margin. So we can just remove that real quick by doing a style tag. Just leaving everything default, and we can select the HTML and body and set the margin to be 0. And just with that little bit of code, you can see that now it fits on the edges. Great. So how about let's just create a few objects now. We can go back to the getting started guide, because I'm also basically learning this at the same time as you do. And you can see that creating objects are pretty simple. So let's just create one for now. So var box equals bodies dot rectangle, and this is a function that creates rectangles, as you might guess from the name. And let's just follow what they say about the position and all of the parameters. So basically this is X position and then Y position and then 80 is the width and the height. Now this function only makes rectangles, but they don't add it to anything, right? It's basically kind of like declaring an object or a variable but not using it. You can name this whatever you want, but now we actually have to add it to the world and add it to the simulation. So what it's telling us to do is using composite, and composite is basically like a group of objects according to the documentation, right? You just need to add it to the world as a group, and you can sit to do stuff. So we just need to pass in engine.world like that, and box, and you can see that it has an array of objects that you need to add, but in our case we only have one object, so we can just type array box. So that's an array with one element, and just like that, let's just save and go back to our file and reload and see a nice little box falling down. So yeah, it looks really cool already, and from this we can also tell two things. First of all, you can see is that this position, so we can know that X is this way and it starts from the left side, right? 400 to the left, and Y it actually starts at the top. So for most simulation and graphics libraries, 0, 0 is at the top left corner, and that's certainly the case with this one. X this way, 400 this way, and down 200, which is why the box is placed here. And I also know that for Matter.js, boxes are positioned at the center of it, so not the top left corner or anything. So yeah, this would be the exact center. Let me create another one called box. Yeah, let's just rebrand this to box A and box B, which we can place at a slightly more to the left position, maybe 420, and we can just pass in box A and box. And you can see they push each other out and they fall down together. Great, and you can see this is really just how simple Matter.js is, right? You just add objects and then it just runs everything for you, and you don't need to care about anything. So yeah, this is really simple, and now we can just create anything we want. Let's create a ground now by doing var ground, which is also a rectangle. It doesn't bounce off at the borders, as you can see, it just falls through. So we can do var ground equals bodies dot rect tangle, just like that. So where should we place the ground for it to be at the bottom? Well, first of all, you can see that this at the bottom, because the X and Y position are from the center. For the X, we need it to be exactly in the middle of the screen, and for the Y, we need it to be all the way on the bottom. So for it to be in the middle, we know inner height or inner width is the full width of the screen. So for it to be half, you just need to divide it by 2. For the height, because we want the full height, we can just do this. So what should we do for the next part? For now, what I'm going to do is just create something like this, right? 820, which creates a very flat thing at the bottom. And of course, I forgot to add it to this array. And you can just do ground. And now why does it not work? You can probably think of why. You can see that the ground also falls through just like everything else. So you want it to stay in place. Which is why there's another parameter, which is the object that you can pass in with all of the settings and options. For this, we can just set as static to be equal to true. Just like that. And now you reload, you can see that it stays at the place, and they just fall and stay there. So after we have done this, of course, we can make something that's a bit more interesting than just a few boxes. So I'm just going to delete these 2 variables here and do something new. We want to add boxes not just at the beginning, but add them as you go, right? So we can use set interval to add something like once every some time. We're going to call the function make box, which obviously doesn't exist yet, and we're going to fire it basically every 100 milliseconds. And now we can just write the function make box, make a box like that, and we can just do let box equals to bodies dot rectangle, and this time we also want to position it in the middle, so we can just do window dot inner width divided by 2. But for the height, we don't want it to be at the bottom, we still want it to be at the top-ish. So we can do something like 200 and then 80, 80. Here we can just add composite.add engine.world and give it a array that's box. Okay, let's just try it and tweak with a bunch of stuff first. First of all, what we can do is also make them not squares but rectangles. So let's make them like this, and you can see that it does this very cool thing, and you can see that rectangles work also very well. But let's change both of these to 40, and there's a few things that we can do. First of all, the friction, right? We can also change this. So instead of friction, we can just change it to 0, and they should just slide right off each other now. Because it's at the same position as a stack, but at some point they should just explode outwards like that. And you can see that now because they have no friction, they kind of flow like water and just slide off each other. Another thing that we can tweak is restitution. And restitution is basically like a fancy word for bounciness, with 0 being not bouncy and 1 being 100% bouncy. We're going to set it to something like 0.8. And you can see that they all bounce off each other very nicely. The stack should tip over pretty soon. And you can see that they're pretty bouncy now. So you can see that there's like really cool stuff that you can do, and you can do all of these like fun stuff. Let's try a new thing that we can do. Let's just make this spawn stuff a bit slower, because inevitably after you spawn a lot of objects, it's just going to get very slow. So we can do it 0.5 seconds. That seems pretty nice. And now instead of making it towards the window in the middle and the set position, how about we can use the mouse position? So to do this, we can use event listener and add it to the window. So add event listener like this, and what we're going to do is mouse move. That's the event that we're going to do. E, this is an arrow function, and yeah, so here declare two variables, mouse x, let's say equals 0, like mouse y also equal to 0. So now we can just say e.client x, which will be the mouse height, the mouse x, and we can just, yeah, mouse x equals e.client x, and mouse y equals e.client y. But of course, just setting these two variables does nothing. We have to pass it into the box. So we can just type in mouse x and mouse y. And now when you refresh the page, you can see that instead of falling just towards the middle of the screen or anything, it follows you and follows your mouse and drops it wherever your mouse is. And yeah, you can just create a very cool looking animation with just a few simple lines of code. So now instead of getting rectangles, because that's boring, let's create circles. And circles, doesn't have x and y. It's most likely just a radius. So let's create circles with radius 40 and save and reload. You can see now it changes everything to circles, just that easily. There's of course also polygons, triangles, everything else, but these are just a few examples. Now here's a few examples of some other stuff that you can do. Let's just revert back to the rectangle thing and set back our width and height. But this time, instead of 0 friction and a lot of bounciness, let's just do friction 1, restitution 0.2. So here what we're going to do is mess with the engine. So one thing that we can do is, for example, engine.gravity. So we can change the gravity of the world, and of course gravity is there's an x and y basically, right? If we set y to 0, because by default there isn't any, like, you can see that now what it does is basically there is no gravity, so it kind of just stays there. But you can see that it's actually not that it's just stuck, it's just that they're floating. If you just do 0.1, you can see that now they fall very, very slowly. So yeah, you don't just have to change gravity when you're setting up. You can change it in a function. You can change it later when someone presses a button or something like that. So you can make tons of fun stuff. So one thing you might notice is that after objects start to pile up, basically they kind of get laggier and laggier because of so many objects that they have to calculate. And Matter.js actually has a way of dealing with it called enable sleeping. And basically what it does is that if it notices objects like at the bottom, they're not really moving anymore. They basically freeze and stop calculating about it until a big force or something pushes it where they awake and start moving again. But normally they can just stop and don't need to be calculated again. So let's just delete the gravity thing and instead type engine.enable sleeping like that. And if you can just set it to a boolean, and we can just set it to true, and you can see what happens is that after they reach the bottom a bit, you can see that if they don't move, they kind of turn gray, and basically they stop being calculated. And yeah, so all of that, it basically saves a lot of energy if you have tons of objects that you want to use. Okay, maybe you don't just want to have random rectangles that hit each other. Maybe you want something that's a bit more cool or have some other functionality, and Matter.js absolutely can do that. One of these things is called constraints, which basically kind of acts as rope or spring, and you can tie two different elements together. So to give you an example of that, let me just basically reset all of the code, right? Delete all of the mouse stuff, and delete all of the make box stuff. All we're going to keep is basically the ground and nothing else. Okay, so here we're going to create 3 boxes. Box A equals bodies.rectangle. We can just do like 500 for now. 500, 300, right? The X and Y. And we can just do 80, 80 for both of them. And then we're going to just copy and paste 3 times. And instead of box A, we can change it to box B and box C. So these boxes, instead of at the same position, we can just offset it slightly by, this could be 400. And the final one would be 500. And then we can declare 2 more variables for the constraints, right? Both of the rope joining them. We can say like the first one called A to B, something like that, equals, what is it equal to constraints? So let me declare a new variable up here. So instead of bodies, we can do constraints. Constraints equals matter.constraint. And now what we can do is we can just type A to B equals constraints dot create. And here, of course, because it's rope, there's no individual position. We just need to specify which 2 boxes they have, right? Which 2 boxes they're connecting. So we can just say body A, like that, and then we can pass it box A, and body B will be, as you expect, box B. Then what we can do is basically repeat the same thing for box B to C. So B to C equals constraints dot create. Instead of body A being box A, body A will be box B, and body B will be box C. So now we have to add all objects and constraints to the world, basically. So what we can do is basically in this array just extend it. Instead of just the ground, we can do box A, box B, box C, and then also A to B and B to C. Be a YouTube video without me messing up at least one thing. So you're not supposed to spell constraints with plural, you're just supposed to call it constraint. Why are bodies called bodies and not singular? I don't know why, but constraint is singular. So now if we reload, you can see that all 3 things, there's this like line joining them, and it's constraints. And you can see, just to show you a bit more clearly, let's just offset the X very slightly. You can see that now they kind of link together, but they're free to rotate around. So yeah, it's really cool. So one thing you can do is give it a static true. So a static true. You can see that now they kind of just swing around on the top, hanging there. Okay, so let's do a wrap up what we learned. We first of all, at the top, we just declared a few aliases, basically a bit of shortcuts, so we don't have to type matter dot all the time. But this does nothing; it's just a few shortcuts. And then we just created the engine and the render, which both are created very easily using the create function, and the render has a few properties or options. The first one being element, being the element that it is located in, and the engine, you just pass in the engine that we just created the line before. And then we set the height and the width and the height of the canvas so that it fills the entire screen with window.innerWidth, which is an object provided by JavaScript by default in the window object. And at the bottom, you can see that you just run render.run render, which will automatically render it, and then use runner by creating runner.create and runner.run, and then passing runner and engine. So engine and render, both you can get it set up and started very simply by just calling the function once. No need to use some fancy loops and stuff, and you just need to call it once. Now your only job is basically to add objects, or bodies, right? You can create a ground by using body.rectangle. You can use body.circle to create circles. You can use body. A lot of stuff. You can look at the documentation. You can create all kinds of different polygons. And yeah, when you create bodies, and you can also create constraints by basically just using constraint.create instead of bodies.create and passing in the body A and body B. Now, when you create these, it doesn't automatically add it to the scene. What you need to do is add it by using composite.add, pass it in the engine.world, which is basically where you want to add it, and then you can just pass in an array of all of the different elements. If you only have one element, you still have to wrap in an array, but just use brackets around the name. So really, you can see that Matter.js, if you think about it more, it's really not that complicated at all. You can see that we did so many different types of like physics simulations, and we never even passed like 40 lines of code. And you can imagine what implementing all of this yourself would take. That would probably take like thousands and hundreds of thousands of lines. But now with this, we just needed to 40 lines of code, and we can create all sorts of different simulations. Now, even with all of the things that we looked at, we barely only scratched the surface with what it can do. You can see that if you click see all demos, there's a lot of different demonstrations. For example, this one is basically just different shapes colliding with each other. You can have a Newton's cradle. You can see that it bounces, the physical collisions are basically perfect. You can have time scaling. This is a really cool one where you can see that the time basically slows down and then it speeds back up again, and then it slows down and then speeds back up. So you can have all sorts of different stuff, right? You can have ray casting. Basically, you can cast rays and see which ones they hit. You can do all sorts of different things. And I would encourage you to play around with the website, look at the code, and yeah, it's all available on GitHub. It's all open source, so that's really cool. Yeah, there's tons of things that you can do. There's also class that I haven't went into before, but I'm sure you can figure it out a bit. And yeah, I hope you learned something really cool today, and if you did, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.